Good morning. It's good to be back at APSAC. It's good to see so many old friends. The subject at hand this morning has to do with religion. Well, how on earth did that happen? How is it that we're spending an hour out of the gate at one of the world's foremost child abuse conferences discussing the subject of religion? For me, the intersection between faith and child protection was crystallized 20 plus years ago. I was directing the National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse, and I took a phone call from a prosecutor in San Diego. And she said, "Today, Victor, in our Children's Advocacy Center, we were interviewing a 7-year-old girl who was sexually abused by her father. And at the end of our forensic interview, we said, 'We've asked you a lot of questions. Do you have any questions for us?' And the girl got nervous and twirled her hair and looked at her toes and said, 'Yeah, I'm just sort of wondering, am I still a virgin in God's eyes?'" And that's a mental health question for sure. It's also a spiritual question. Well, how do multidisciplinary teams help a child process a question with so many implications? To that end, toward that goal, what I'd like to do this morning is to chat with you a little bit about what exactly is spirituality. What does the research tell us about the impact on our spirituality if we're a victim of child abuse or neglect? How does spiritual impairment inhibit our ability to disclose an abusive experience, things that MDTs need to be aware of? What does the research say in terms of how spirituality can help a child cope with being a victim of child maltreatment? How do we, as multidisciplinary teams within our institutions and working with faith leaders, assist a child in coping spiritually with trauma? And how can we develop healthy collaborations between faith and child protection communities toward the goal of preventing child maltreatment? Does that sound like an okay agenda? Say yes, makes me feel better. Can you say you the man? Who let the dogs out? Woo, woo, woo. Anything at all to keep us going in Salt Lake City this morning. The United States is a very religious country. I did not fully appreciate that till I began to train in Europe and other parts of the world that are not as religious. In the United States, Gallup and Pew say about 90% of Americans express a faith in God or a higher power. 55% of Americans say religion influences their day in and day out functioning. It's a big part of their decision making. This study surprises folks, but Rutgers published a study saying that church membership today is actually higher than it was in the colonial era. I suppose in the colonial era, you couldn't get to church easily on Sunday with the wagons and whatnot. 40% of Americans attend church or another religious service every single week. 85% attend a religious service at least once a year. And some sociologists predict these figures will actually increase in the decades to come. And their argument is that our population is aging, and as we get older, we tend to think of mortality and life after death. We tend to be gravitating toward the south, warmer climates of the country, and as David Finkelhor just reminded us in his recent study, the South is the most religious region of the country, so we often adapt to the larger culture. And minorities are increasing in the United States, and a number of studies say that minorities are much more religious than are Caucasians. We'll see if those predictions hold sway in the decades to come. That's a broad overview. In terms of our specific religious demographics in the United States, 54% of Americans say to Gallup and Pew that they are Christian in a Protestant community. 24% say they are Christian in a Catholic community. And then we see relatively small percentages of other faith traditions in the United States. The category of nuns gets a lot of press every election year. This is increasing. The most recent Pew data actually has it up to 25%. These are Americans who say to a pollster, "I'm either agnostic or atheist, or I'm not quite sure what my religious belief is." Some folks in that category do acknowledge a sense of spirituality. They're just not actively engaged in any faith community anymore. Bottom line, if you exclude the category of nuns, about 80% of Americans describe themselves as Christian. And if you take out the nuns, then 95% of those who identify with a religious tradition are either Catholic or Protestant. It's important to keep those demographics in mind when we go through some of the research in a moment, because all of the research was done in the United States, and we are a heavily Christian community. So folks say to me, would this research be different if I'm working with a Buddhist or a Muslim or somebody outside of a Christian circle? I don't know, because that hasn't been fully explored in the research. Would there be nuances between a Catholic and a Lutheran and a Baptist or a Methodist? That also hasn't been fully explored in the research either. Does that caveat make sense? You look tired. Do you need a do you need a joke? My only joke is this one. My daughter Naomi, when she was about 7 years old, she loved to tell a joke she would learn at school every day. So she greets me at the door one evening and says, Dad, what is big and green, and if it fell out of a tree, it would kill you? Do you know? A pool table. Isn't that funny? You go home tonight, you'll think about that, you'll laugh, you just can't. So what exactly is spirituality? It's a very personal concept. It is in the eyes of the beholder. The Oxford American Dictionary says it has to do with religion or religious belief. It's related or affecting the human spirit or soul as opposed to material or physical things. Well, we won the Revolutionary War. We don't have to listen to England anymore. Donald Walker, who is... Yeah, we are apolitical. Donald Walker, who is one of the leading researchers on the spiritual impact of trauma, he defines it as a search or quest for the sacred, a private, personal, affective experience with the divine. He says it often overlaps with religiosity. Spirituality is this search for something outside of ourselves, something higher than us. Religiosity has to do with our creeds, our belief systems, but he says most of the research on survivors say the two are mingled together and you can't separate them. However we define it, however an individual survivor processes spirituality, we know it's a really, really big deal. One of the frustrations I've had as a child protection professional is I can't think of any research that is so large that has been so ignored by frontline professionals and by leading academics in the community. And yet, the research is very clear. In 2009, Dr. Walker and other professionals for the American Psychological Association published this literature review, and at that time they found 34 major studies on 19,000 maltreated children, and they found the sum total of this research says that a majority of the children you work with have been impacted spiritually, and when they're impacted spiritually, that may impair their ability to cope physically and emotionally. Here's one study that's illustrative. Study of 527 victims of child abuse. Some are physically abused, some sexually abused, some emotionally abused, many all of the above, because we know from David Finkelhor and others on polyvictimization research that when you're abused one way, you're often abused in multiple ways. Every single child in this study, the researchers concluded, was spiritually impacted as a result of abuse. And it manifested itself in feelings of guilt, anger, grief, despair, doubt, afraid of dying, a belief that God is unfair. Well, how does that translate in the real world? Some years ago, I was part of a team that investigated physical and sexual abuse in a boarding school in Senegal, Africa, and I saw the research come to life before me. I interviewed a man who was in his 40s, and he said to me, Victor, do you think that God understands ACE research? And I said, tell me about that. What are you asking me? And he said, well, Victor, I understand ACE research. I was beaten on this compound. I was raped on this compound. They pulled out my teeth on this compound without Novocaine. My very best friend killed himself on this compound. I get it. I got an ACE score through the stratosphere. And that probably explains why, when I grew up, I developed problems with alcohol and drug addictions. It probably explains why I'm so promiscuous, why I was unfaithful to each of my 3 wives. It probably explains why sometimes I'd be so anxious I just have to go into a bar and get drunk and pick a fight with the biggest person because it just felt good to hit somebody. But the worst thing I ever did is I killed somebody. He said, Victor, I was high on drugs one day and I crossed the divider line in the highway in Alabama and I accidentally took a man's life. So they sent me to prison for criminal vehicular homicide. I'm out of prison. I got a job. I'm cleaning up my life. I haven't taken drugs or gotten drunk in a year. I think I'm in pretty good shape, but I'm terrified of dying because if I die tonight, I don't know if God understands ACE research. I don't know if I get a pass when I meet my Maker for all the horrible things I've done because of the terrible childhood. Does God understand ACE research? That's a spiritual impact that needs to be addressed. A woman in that case said to me that she was sexually abused by a missionary doctor, and the doctor said to her, you are so lucky, you are so special. I could have sexually touched any child in this compound, but I purposely selected you because of all the 12-year-old girls I'm working with, your breasts are the most developed. And she told me she developed this tremendous anger toward God because she thought, God is all-knowing, so God must have known if my breast grew early, this man would be sexually attracted to me. And yet I had no ability to regulate the growth of my body. So at the end of the day, I hold God responsible. I'm just so mad at God. That's a spiritual injury. However, even if you have a spiritual injury, even if you're angry with God, even if you distance yourself from organized religion, it doesn't mean you've lost your sense of spirituality. It doesn't mean you've lost your quest for understanding. One man in that case said to me, I ain't going to do it. I'm never going to go back to church. I'm never going to trust anybody with a collar. I want nothing to do with organized religion. Religion's just a cover for the abuse of children. But then he said, every morning I get up very early and I read my Bible 2 hours before I go to work. And I said, tell me about that. Why do you read your Bible so often? And he said, I don't know, Victor. You're the expert. I thought you could tell me. He said, I guess I'm searching for something. A woman in that case said for 20 years she wanted nothing to do with religion, and then she said to me she was in a grocery store and she couldn't really explain it, but she just felt the presence of God, and she felt as if God were whispering to her, I didn't do it. I didn't hurt you. I was weeping in your days of suffering. You and I should have a conversation again. And she said she didn't know what to do with that experience, so she came home and she tore from the yellow pages the address of every area church. She got into her car. She drove to her church. She said to the pastor, show me your child protection policies. And if the pastor said no, she'd flip him off, put out a cigarette in his carpet, and say, you're no better than the people who molested me. She'd go to the next church, and the pastor would say, oh, yeah, somewhere here. Yeah, we passed that, I think, 3 years ago. Oh, yeah, here it is. And she'd give the policy. And she'd read it and say, well, that's like 2 paragraphs. You didn't put any thought into that. I bet you got it from the insurance company just to lower your rate, right? This wouldn't have protected me so long ago. You're no better than a child molester yourself. And again, she'd flip him off and put out a cigarette in her carpet. She did this 15 or 20 times. She had to stop at a convenience store because she was out of cigarettes. And then she told me after 25 times she went into a church, she was about to give up, and the pastor was so kind and said to her, yeah, we have a policy. In fact, we have a standing child protection committee. We work very closely with the local Children's Advocacy Center. We update it every year. Everybody's required to go through training. We're always trying to take it to a higher level, but I'm sure it's not perfect. We would love your input. We're always trying to get better. And she read through those policies and said, this isn't half bad. This might have protected me so long ago. But then she looked the pastor in the eye and she said, but I know people like you. When push comes to shove and it's the word of a child against a powerful person in the church, there ain't no way you stand with me. You always stand with the oppressor. And she was shocked at the pastor's response. The pastor said, you're right. That has been a sad legacy within our Christian community. But, you know, we actually had the scenario you're talking about a few years ago. We had a girl who made an outcry against her father, who was the president of our church board. And it's a very public case. You can Google it and read all about it, and you'll see that we complied with our policies. We reported to the authorities. We removed him from any connection with youth. And we supported spiritually the child and her family. The offender is in prison, and the child and her family are still active in our congregation. And she said, you bet, Pastor, I'm going to check that out when I get home. And you better be telling me the truth. Otherwise, I'm going to come back and put out a cigarette in your carpet. She found out he was telling the truth, and she told me that's the congregation she joined because it's the only congregation she could find that witnessed its faith through its child protection policies. This is predictable, this is common sense, but it is nice when common sense is supported by research. When the person who abuses a child is the pastor, priest, rabbi, imam, Sunday school teacher, closely connected to the child's faith tradition, the impact on their sense of spirituality is pronounced. In this study, the researchers asked men, they were all men in the study, who were convicted of sexually abusing children in their congregation. They were all clergymen. And they said to these men, what was going on in your brain when you were sexually violating children that God had placed in your care? And here are some of the cognitive distortions they heard. Men would say, well, I'm basically a good person. I'm always giving blood to the Red Cross. I'm serving soup at the homeless shelter. When there's a natural disaster, I'm among the first on the scene to help those troubled souls. And all the good things I do in my life overshadow the teeny tiny problem that I have, that I touch some children sexually. Some of the offenders would say to the researchers, you know what, God made me this way. God gave me these intense urges to touch children sexually. God sent me into the priesthood. God gave me unbridled access to these children. God wanted me to act out sexually. And quite frankly, it was good for these children. I brought them out of their shell. I was teaching them sex education. I made them who they are today. Now, these cognitive distortions were bad enough, but then the researchers said, did you communicate these twisted ideas of yours to the children you were violating? And what do you think the answer was? All the time. Father Murphy, who sexually abused 200 deaf and hard of hearing children in Milwaukee, he would take a child into the confessional and he would say, God has asked me to teach you sex education today. And then he would sexually violate the child. And then he would say to the boy, because it happened in the confessional, because it happened in this holy spot, you are not allowed to talk about it. If you ever talk about it, you will lose the grace of God. If you ever talk about it, you will surely go to hell. Would that mess you up emotionally? Would that mess you up spiritually? And sure enough, as these children grow, this study found they were angry with God. They wanted nothing to do with organized religion. Their relationship with God, the researchers said, ceases to grow as if they're stuck at a moment in time. Well, how often does your garden variety sex offender incorporate religion into the abuse of a child? Don't know for sure, but there's some research that say a lot of them do. This is a very old study, 25 years ago, but Abel talked to almost 4,000 convicted child molesters, and 93% of them described themselves as religious or very religious. Here's a more recent study. 2010, Christianity Today surveyed almost 3,000 church leaders across the country, and 20%, 1 out of 5, said they knew of at least one convicted sex offender who was a member or attending services at their place of worship. This study from 2006, they talked to convicted child molesters, and they found that those sex offenders who grew up in the church, who remained active in their faith community, those were the sex offenders who were the most trusted, and they were able to accumulate the most victims, the youngest victims, and they would get away with it for the longest period of time. Well, why is it that so many sex offenders are religious? Why is it that so many sex offenders want to come to your church, your synagogue, your temple? Well, sex offenders say to clinicians and to researchers, it's the safest place. It's the safest place. Are you kidding me? If I want to sexually abuse children, I want to go to church because they have the weakest child protection policies. It's not like the Boy Scouts or the YMCA or some of these other secular institutions. They got rigorous policies. And the Boy Scouts put child abuse detective Mike Johnson in charge of their policies. It's harder now to access children in the Boy Scouts. So I want to go to church because they usually don't have very good policies. And even if they have policies that are pretty good, ain't nobody going to enforce them. And even if they have pretty good policies and somebody is kind of looking out for children, there's no training. And without training, I can always get past a policy. I'm not saying that. Sex offenders are saying that to clinicians or researchers. Some sex offenders say people in the faith community are so gullible, they will accept anything. Anna Salter, in her book Predators, tells this story of a child molester gets out of prison. He goes to a Baptist church in Milwaukee, and he says, I want to level with you, Pastor. I just got out of prison. I was in prison for writing bad checks. Now, for those of you who aren't prosecutors, you're just going to have to take my word for it. You would have to write a lot of bad checks before you'd actually go to prison. That's the first clue. This guy was not telling the truth. He was in prison, but it wasn't for writing bad checks. It was for sexually touching children. But they accepted his word. They didn't check up on it. And then he says to the pastor, you know, I was a bad person. I was a thief. And then one day at the Greystone Chapel in the prison, I had a born-again experience. The choir was singing a beautiful hymn, and it led to my conversion. And I left behind my thieving ways. And today, my first day of freedom, I'm walking past your church, and the children's choir is singing the same exact hymn that led to my conversion. What a clear message from God. This is the church I need to be part of. But would you welcome me, Pastor? Would you welcome down a broken down old sinner like me? He begins to cry. The pastor begins to cry. The pastor says, son, there was a thief on the cross. And he welcomes him into the church. And before you know it, he becomes the director of the children's choir. And after he's arrested for sexually abusing half a dozen children, the detectives in Milwaukee find he was doing the same exact game in another Protestant church in another part of the community. Gullible religious people. You don't, though, have to look at the research. Just use your Google engine. You'll see this pattern repeated over and over again. The New York Times did a series of articles about Father Murphy and the 200 children he sexually abused. I was actually giving a keynote address at a national conference of survivors of clergy abuse. I talked about Father Murphy. I talked about Stephen Gear, who's mentioned up on the screen. I didn't know Stephen was in the audience. And he came up to me afterwards. Stephen's completely deaf. I don't communicate with sign language, so we had some challenges. But eventually he communicated to me that he liked what I had to say. But he said, the next time you talk about my case, the next time you talk about what Father Murphy did to us as boys, you need to tell everybody in the audience, we were just little boys in that confessional. Now, what was he trying to say? So often when a survivor comes forward, one study says the average delay for boys is 20 years. So often they come forward, they're in their 30s, their 40s, their prime of life. They've got a good job, they've got a good family. Everything seems to go so well. And the offender, the priest, the pastor, the rabbi, they're out in a nursing home. They're an old man. They're dying. They got all sorts of health and other problems. There's this built-in incentive to feel sorry for the offender. And Stephen was saying, you cannot see it that way. You must see it through my eyes. You must see me as a little boy, alone and frightened in the confessional, far away from my parents, and Father Murphy is the big, strong, strapping man who has the imprimatur of God around him. You must see it through my eyes. So if you ever run into Stephen, you tell him at the APSAC Colloquium keynote, I kept my word, and I told you what he wanted me to say. This is not a Catholic problem. This is a problem in every faith community. I'm a Lutheran, so let me pick on my Lutheran heritage. The old-timers here, Dave Corwin, Petty, Toth, Lucy Berliner, the old-timers here will remember Ralph Underwager. He would often testify on behalf of accused sex offenders. He had a mental health background. He was also an ordained Lutheran minister, and he gave an interview to the Journal of Pedophilia, which no longer exists. But in that interview, he said, pedophiles have to be more positive, make the claim that pedophilia is an acceptable expression of God's will for love and unity among human beings. Even if you're not theologically trained, that is not good doctrine, right? And I have no idea what he meant to communicate, but the point is, this was a journal read by pedophiles, and how many of them used these pastors' words in the sexual abuse of a child. Only God knows. Here's an example from Indiana of how a pastor incorporated religion into the abuse of a child. Pastor Jack Scapp headed a megachurch in Indiana, and according to public documents, you can find them all online, the government said that he selected a victim who was particularly susceptible to being sexually abused. He sees an email in the church describing this child as frightened, confused, emotionally traumatized, engaging in self-destructive behaviors such as cutting. Do you think a sex offender would be attracted to this child? This is a very easy child for him to violate. That same email describes her as having a tender heart. She's teachable and moldable. So Pastor Scapp springs into action. He begins to counsel the child. She shares with him that she had a boyfriend that she thought was the cat's meow, and she had her whole life planned out. She was going to go out and get married and live in a house with a picket fence and 2.5 children and a dog named Pancake. I had a dog named Pancake, so I just threw that in. She had her whole life mapped out, but then this boy jilts her, and she's really traumatized, and she's sharing this with Pastor Scapp. And Scapp transitions from being her pastor to her friend to sexually abusing her in 3 different states, which is why it becomes a federal crime. And when the FBI investigates, they find all sorts of written documentation showing how he used religion in the abuse of the child. Here's a letter he wrote to the victim. You opened your heart wide to me. You made me more than a pastor or rescuer. You made me your friend, your confidant, your beloved. In our fantasy talk, you've affectionately spoken of being my wife. That is exactly what Christ desires for us. He wants to marry us. He wants us to become eternal lovers. Oh, I tried to craftily catch your heart. Thank you for the privilege of helping a struggling teenager. You've got such a wonderful life ahead of you. I must be careful not to spoil that with my selfish fantasy desires. When we get scared, Jesus sends his Spirit to live within us. I must follow the example of Christ. I have espoused you to him as a chaste virgin. This is a letter the victim wrote to Scapp. I was in love with you. I wouldn't admit that I was a victim. I felt so guilty, partially responsible. Maybe it was my fault, exactly what the spiritual injury research is documenting. Then I became really angry toward God, exactly what the spiritual injury research is documenting. For a second, I didn't believe in God, exactly what the spiritual injury research is documenting. She goes on to say, I thought there couldn't be a God because he wouldn't let it happen. And if there is a God, I hate him because he let this happen, because you, Pastor Scapp, told me God was okay with this. My entire life, she wrote to the judge, the church had been my universe. Growing up, I watched Scap in church, listened to his sermons 3 times a week. I was raised by my parents and teachers to trust and obey my pastor. He was a celebrity to me, a father figure, a man of God. I felt most safe when I was in church. I first met Scap when I was in kindergarten, and I still had my baby teeth. As my pastor, I sought guidance and counseling. He told me to confide in him. He told me I was special, that he loved me, that he wanted to marry me. He told me I was his precious gift from God. Similar to what that clergy study that I just articulated said. He made me believe that what we were doing was okay and right in the eyes of God. I felt so special when he texted me from the holy altar during his sermons. Do you think she would benefit from medical care? The ACE research says this could impact her medical well-being. Would she benefit from mental health care? Would she benefit from spiritual care to undo the twisted theology of Pastor Scap? How many of you are law enforcement officers or frontline child protection workers? Well, some of you. So a few thoughts for you as we work through all of this. You need to be aware of this research, be aware of the possibility of spiritual injuries and how that may inhibit a child's sharing of their abuse history. Look for clues in that initial intake. I consulted on a case in Florida in a Christian school where a teenage girl, didn't come back after recess, and a teacher goes and tracks down the girl and finds her in a girl's lavatory crying. And she says, "Tell me what's wrong, what's going on?" And the girl says through her tears, "I think God is mad at me. I think God is really, really mad at me." And she says, "Tell me about that." And she goes on to disclose that a youth minister at the church was sexually abusing her. And that becomes the mandated report. We've already got a clue that there's a spiritual injury and that perhaps religion was incorporated, and she believes that God is upset with her. Look at the setting of the abuse. If it happened inside a faith community, if the alleged offender is a member of the clergy or a faith-based leader, there's a pretty good chance religion was incorporated into the abuse and is a dynamic to be concerned about. Do you know anything about the particular faith traditions in your community? The accreditation standards for the Children's Advocacy Center says you need to get out and learn about the local religious communities. What are they teaching? What is the belief system? How may this influence a child one way or the other? I consulted on a case in Missouri where some detectives called me one day and they say, "Hey, we heard you talking about that spiritual injury stuff, and darn it, I think we got one of those cases." And I said, "Well, tell me what you got." Well, we got this very charismatic church, and apparently every church service they play really emotional music, and the pastor encourages parishioners to stand up and confess their sins in front of the congregation. Well, apparently this Sunday morning he did that, and this guy stands up and he starts to cry, and he confesses that he sexually abused all his children. And then the pastor turns to his children and says, "Now I want each of you to stand up and confess your role in this sexual activity." So he makes them confess. Then he says to the children, the perpetrator, and the whole congregation, "This is all washed away in the blood of the Lamb. Nobody's allowed to talk about this anymore. If you talk about it, you will surely lose the grace of God. Now go on and be fruitful and multiply." Well, the good news is 3 or 4 men in the congregation that morning got out into the parking lot and they said, "I don't know about you, but I ain't going to this church anymore. And hey, before we head to Perkins, how about we stop by the police station and tell them what happened this morning?" So they did, and they said to the detectives, the good news is he confessed to us and 200 people in the congregation. The bad news is the children, they think they're going to go to hell if they tell you what their papa's been doing to them. So, hey, good luck. We're at Perkins. You got any follow-up questions for us? So the detectives called me and said, "Gosh, what do we do here? Normally we do the forensic interview first, but these kids are terrified they're going to go to hell." And I said, there's an exception to every rule, and the most important factor is what's best for the children. We already got a confession, so let's start backwards. Why don't you interrogate the guy first and say, "Hey, understand something happened at church. Some of the men stopped by and told us what happened. He's probably going to confess to you. It shouldn't be very difficult." Then I think you want to go to the pastor and say, "Hey, a lot of people are telling us that he confessed to sexually abusing children, and in fact, he confessed to sexually abusing kids. And I understand that you told people they can't talk about it. Are you aware of our mandated reporting law and obstruction of justice charges? And, I'm going to have to send this to the prosecutor, but I think it would go better for you if you would admit you just made a big old mistake. And let us say to the victims that you just flat out screwed up. And of course, they can talk about it. They're not going to go to hell." And that's exactly what happened. So when they did the interviews, they could comfort the children and say, "Hey, we talked to your dad. We talked to folks at the church. We know what happened this morning. We talked to your pastor, and he made some mistakes, and he's willing to admit that to you. And he says, perfectly okay to talk about what happened. And so we took away all that fear. They disclosed what happened, and the offender eventually goes to prison. Thinking outside the box when you have one of these issues. We want to ideally interview kids in a Children's Advocacy Center or another child-friendly environment. If you do have to do an emergency interview, which happens sometimes, be cognizant. If the alleged offender is a clergy person, be cognizant of doing an emergency interview in a church or a synagogue where there might be religious symbols. I'm not aware of research on this, but there's a number of books written by survivors where they say a Star of David or a cross or a religious symbol was triggering to them because it was incorporated into their abuse. Well, how might that happen? I consulted on a case where in the forensic interview, the girl says, when my daddy does sex to me, I feel sad, and my Mr. Jesus, he's just watching in the room. He doesn't make it stop. Well, as it turns out, she was sexually abused in her bedroom. There's a picture of Jesus on the wall. So when Dad was violating her, she would focus on that picture, and she'd be praying in her mind, Jesus, come out of the picture, Jesus, help me, right? So could you imagine if you did an emergency interview at, say, her church, and there's a room with a picture of Jesus, it could be a trigger. I consulted on another case where the child was told by her father when he sexually abused her, you just focus on the cross on the wall, as he would masturbate her toward orgasm. You just focus on the cross on the wall. And she says that to this day, just a cross necklace would be triggering for her. It conjures back up all those meanings. So we need to be careful of those sorts of things when we interview children. Be alert for a spiritual block or problem that may come up in the interview, such as the case in San Diego where the girl said, am I still a virgin in God's eyes? The child may themselves talk about it in the forensic interview. A case in Pennsylvania, the girl said her dad would tuck her into bed at night, make her say her bedtime prayers, and then he would say to her, see, you just prayed for God's protection. And yet God didn't stop me from touching you sexually, so God must be okay with what we're doing. She articulated that in the forensic interview. How many of you are forensic interviewers? A good chunk of you. A few thoughts. I think these statements can be very helpful to children who are abused within a religious context. You're not in trouble with me. They have probably been told that they are in trouble in their family. They might be in trouble in their church or their religious community. For you to say you're not in trouble with me could be a really big deal. It could be very comforting and want them to stay in the room a little longer. This is a safe place. You can't promise it's going to be safe outside that forensic interview room. It may not be safe in their home. It may not be safe in their church. They may be completely alone, but this room is safe. That may be comforting, may make them want to stay in dialogue with you a little longer. You know, I talk to lots of boys or lots of girls. No matter what happened, it's not your fault. They probably have been told it's their fault. They probably have been told that God is angry with them. For you to say whatever happened, it's not your fault, that's a very different message. If the child asks you religious questions, I would suggest it's probably not a good idea to delve into that. You're probably not qualified. You're a forensic interviewer. So if the child says, am I still a virgin in God's eyes, ask the question back. You'll generate more information for the team. Why are you asking me that? And you probably get a lot of information of how religion was incorporated into the abuse. If the child still repeats the question, assure him or her that somebody will sit down and help them process that. Hey, that's a really important question. I want to make sure somebody sits down with you. I'm not sure I'm the best person, but I promise you somebody will sit down with you probably yet today and help you begin to process these difficult questions and then follow up to make sure that actually happens. How many of you are part of case review team meetings? Yeah, a huge chunk of you. So just as you at a team meeting would address what's the game plan for addressing the physical and emotional needs, what's the game plan for addressing the spiritual needs of the child, if it's important to that boy or girl? Do you have a therapist on your team or in your community who can not only use evidence-based approaches for helping children cope with trauma, but who are aware of the spiritual injury research? Ideally, it'd be cool if one of them shared the faith tradition of the child you're working with, or at the very least, are they sensitive to the faith traditions of a child that they may be working with? If you don't have such a person, you need to begin to develop those resources. Consider having one or more members of the faith community as part of your case review team. A number of MDTs have done that over the past decade, and at least 2 CACs have added a chaplain, a full-time chaplain to their staff, and I'll share with you in a minute how that has transformed. How many of you are victim advocates or prosecutors? Well, on your victim forms, maybe ask the child or the adult survivor, is spirituality important to you? Would you like to see a chaplain or somebody else who's specially trained to work through these issues? At the CAC in Greenville, South Carolina, they have a full-time chaplain. They do ask those questions, and last year, 535 children or adult survivors asked to see the chaplain who was specifically trained in trauma-informed care and specifically trained on the spiritual impact of trauma. And we're now working with researchers in Texas to research the efficacy of the model in that particular CAC. Some of you know I'm a survivor of cancer. When I was diagnosed by the Mayo Clinic with cancer some years ago, my doctor said one of the kindest things I've ever heard. Victor, I know you're a person of faith. Would you like to see one of our chaplains before you go home today? They're really good at helping people who just got a very difficult diagnosis. And I declined. I just wanted to go home and talk to my wife. But I thought it was a very kind approach. And hospitals have been doing this for a very long time. They know that this can be helpful. My father had a very dangerous heart surgery a couple years ago. He was 85 at the time of the surgery, and he was so nervous in pre-op. He was making silly jokes. I just knew he was really nervous, and Mom and I couldn't calm him down. But then a chaplain came in and said, Don, can I pray with you? Can I put my hand on your shoulder? And you could just see my dad relax. And then he turned to my mom, whose name is Lily, and he said to her, Lily, I'm okay. I'm at peace with whatever happens today. Hospitals have been doing this for over 100 years. A cancer diagnosis or facing the possibility of death during surgery is no less traumatic than being beaten or raped or starved, and we need to make spiritual services available for those children who could benefit from it. How about a clergy person as a support person? The value of prayer before trial. That 7-year-old girl who said, am I a virgin in God's eyes? When she went to trial, before she walked into the courthouse, she tugged on the skirt of the prosecutor and said, Miss Kathy, is it okay if we say a prayer before we go into court? What's the answer to that question? Yes, but who should say the prayer, the prosecutor or the child? The child, because you have no idea what's in her heart. So Miss Kathy said, sure, honey, but you say the prayer. And the little girl folded her hands and said, Dear God, please don't let the defense attorney yell at me like he did that other hearing. He's just a scary man. Amen. Well, the prosecutor, who was not particularly religious, said, I think I can be the answer to that prayer. And so she approached the bench and said, Judge, this is the prayer outside the courtroom, and I didn't pick up on it, but he is kind of loud, so make him tone it down a little bit, right? And she thought God had answered her prayer. The prosecutor thinks she did it. Maybe it was a combination of the two. It sounds really good, and I've given you some powerful stories, but is there any research to say that this would be helpful to children or adult survivors? There is. There's quite a bit of research. In 2012, the American Psychological Association, published this literature review, and they said even if we exclude all the research on adult survivors, there's still a meaningful body of research on children saying that spiritual care can be of assistance to them in coping with trauma, including child abuse. Here's one study that's illustrative where they found that the victims of abuse at very young ages, every part of you, including your spirituality, is developing. So if you're 4, you're 5, and then you're abused, you tend to be stuck in time. I'm just so mad at God. If you're older when you're abused, you're 15 or 16, you've got more spiritual well-being in the bank, so to speak, more to draw upon. So the impact is less pronounced. That's a general overview. But nonetheless, they found older or younger children, if they could figure out a way to cope spiritually, they did a lot better in the short and long term. And here's other studies that bear that out. And all these slides and a number of other documents, I gave you 12 other handouts, will be available to you so you can drill down a little more on the research. This from Johns Hopkins a couple years ago, 10,000 folks they looked at, and they found that those who maintained a healthy sense of spirituality, a meaningful connection to their faith tradition, even if they had a high A score and there was no medical or mental health intervention, it seemed to be mitigating the high A score. It was still impacting them, but it wasn't as pronounced as it was in others with a high A score. And in terms of potential impact on health, Koenig from Duke did this lit review, and he said, and apparently he's read them all, I haven't done that, but he said there are 3,000 quantitative studies and several thousand more qualitative studies saying a healthy sense of spirituality is positively correlated with good health outcomes. The American Psychological Association recognizes this issue, and they have published not one but 2 treatises. How many of you are mental health professionals? I would encourage you to have these treatises on your shelf. And in these treatises, they say, yeah, absolutely, use trauma-informed best practices, cognitive behavioral therapy, and the like. But within that context, you can explore whether spirituality is important to a victim of child abuse. And if it is, within that context, you can begin to help them process whatever spiritual questions they may have. This APA study from 2000 said there are multiple ways where faith and mental health providers can collaborate. In some cases, the clergy could be a consultant to the mental health provider. I consulted on a case in the Lutheran community where a woman was in her 40s, and she said to her psychologist, "I'm going to hell. There's absolutely no hope for me." And the therapist said, "Tell me about that. Why do you think you're going to hell?" And she said, "Because I disabuse the body of Christ. And it says in the Bible that if you disabuse the body of Christ, there's just no hope for you." Well, the therapist had no idea what to do, but she had heard me speak, and so she called me and said, "What am I supposed to do? I think you said you're Lutheran, right?" And I said, "Hey, I actually know some Lutheran pastors who really trauma-informed care in your community, and I can connect you with them, and she might want to talk with them, and the two of you could tag team." And that's exactly what happened. For those of you who are not Lutheran, here was the dynamic. In the Lutheran community, you don't take communion until you're 13 and you're confirmed, because in Lutheran tradition, there is this verse in the Bible where Paul said, "Be careful, you're taking the body and blood of Christ." And so you need to be careful. You need not to take this lightly, and you need to be careful with what you're doing here and make sure your heart is in the right place. Otherwise, you could drink or eat it to your judgment. And so she learned that, and it was bothering her for this reason. Her dad sexually abused her for years, and before she was confirmed, her dad said, "But I'm going to stop when you're confirmed and you start to take communion, because then Christ will be inside you, and I'm not going to sexually abuse Christ." So she just survived, thinking as soon as I'm 13 and I'm confirmed and I take communion, it's going to stop. The night before her first communion, Dad came and raped her again. And then when the sexual assault was done, she said, "But it's over now, Dad. You always promised me when I start to take communion it won't happen." And he gave her an evil laugh and said, "Honey, I just said that to keep you quiet. We're not going to stop a good thing." And so the next day when she took communion for the first time, she said to her therapist, she spit in the communion cup when she was chewing the wafer. In her mind, she was saying to God, "I am chewing you up, Jesus, and in an hour I'm going to be pooping you into the toilet and flushing you the hell away from me." And now she's in her 40s, and what she did that day is torturing her. Can you see the benefit of spiritual care? So a Lutheran minister sat down with her and talked about stories. Let's go through the Bible here together. When Jesus was being crucified, what did he say? "Forgive them, Lord. They just don't know what they're doing." So if God could forgive the people who were torturing his body, certainly he's not upset with you for what you did that day at communion. God stands with those who are suffering. A therapist may need to be a consultant to the faith person. Some survivors just won't go to a psychologist, but they will go to their rabbi, their priest, their imam, their faith leader. They need to have a good connection to a mental health provider, because if somebody's articulating suicidal thoughts or they're engaging in cutting behaviors, that's well beyond their field of expertise. They need somebody they can reach out to for some guidance. This article said each side, faith and child protection communities, need to have good referrals. So in the CAC, if a child needs follow-up spiritual care, you need to have a good list of referrals, not just any old priest, not any old rabbi, not any old pastor, but those who are trauma-informed and know how to coordinate pastoral care with the mental health provider and the medical provider. And just the reverse is true. The faith leaders need to know who's a good psychologist to refer to if somebody's articulating a history of abuse. This article says we can collaborate in a limited way and ideally in a full way. I'm not telling tales out of school. My wife Lisa gives lectures in churches all over Minnesota about her coping with mental illness. And one of the things she says in her workshops, she says, "Look, when I finally get a diagnosis of depression from my doctor, and we're talking about possible medications that could help me with my mood swings, and my doctor gives me a referral to a secular psychologist, and I'm working with this therapist, and we're making great progress. But eventually in therapy, all my questions are spiritual. All my questions are spiritual. I'm asking my therapist, what does God say about depression? What does God say if you're so deeply sad you can't get out of bed for 6 or 7 days and you're neglecting the needs of your children? What does God have to say about sadness at that level?" And her therapist said, I don't know what God says, and I don't share your faith tradition, and I've never read the Bible, and I just don't know how to help you here. But clearly, these are very important questions to you. So to make a long story short, eventually, she had a medical provider, a mental health provider, and a spiritual care worker. She signed releases so they could all tag team. And Lisa says that she was a three-legged stool. She needed medical care, mental health care, spiritual care. And if you took away any of those legs, her little stool would have fallen to the floor, and she would have been back in bed. This article, among others, says we need to do more of that. Donald Walker says a lot of children are abused with a sacred text, and the answer to bad theology, he says, is good theology. He says you can often powerfully undo a theological construct with a good theological construct. I consulted on a case in the Baptist church where a Baptist minister sexually abused his daughter, and the little girl said, "Dad, I think this is wrong. I think it's sinful. I don't think we should be doing this anymore." And the pastor says, "Well, that's normally true, but there are exceptions." And he opens the Bible to the account of the creation of the world in Genesis. And he says when it was just Adam and Eve, God had to use incest to populate the earth. And after the great flood, it was just Noah and Noah's family. And again, God used incest to repopulate the earth. You know, honey, how in the Bible, oftentimes God comes to somebody in a dream. Well, God has come to me in a dream, and he's told me that our Christian community is under attack, so we need to repopulate from within. I don't want to touch you sexually, but God has instructed me to do so, to prepare you to be a young mother in a few years. You could undo that bad theology with good theology. Walker found in his research that a story is very helpful to children. So you could talk about stories in the Bible. Anybody here who went to Sunday school, you remember then the account of Jesus being tempted by the devil in the wilderness? What was the devil quoting to Jesus? Scripture, right? He was quoting the Bible, right? And what did Jesus do in response? He quoted the Bible better, right? And so you could go through a story like that and say, not everybody who quotes the Bible is operating on behalf of God. Sometimes they're operating on really dark and evil forces, right? And so let's look at other parts of the Bible where Jesus said, better a millstone around your neck than to hurt a child. How you treat a child, Jesus says, tells everything about what you really think about God. There are better answers in the Bible. God was with you and those who are suffering. Diane Langberg's a PhD psychologist who has specialized in counseling survivors of abuse within the church. And she says a lot of times survivors want to connect to their faith tradition, but they're afraid to pick up the Bible. And so she will direct them to the Psalms or the prophets to help somebody find the words to pray again and to express their fears, their emotions. You know, the prophets are really angry and denouncing the church. Jeremiah says, you religious people, you think you're so holy, and you go into the synagogue and you say, I'm in the temple, I'm safe. Well, God sees the blood on your hand. God sees what you do in the dead of the night. So God is with those who are suffering, even against religious leaders who do evil things. God sees everything. And of course, the Psalms are great laments and expressing anger toward God. Why are you so silent? Why are you not coming to me? This was written by a rabbi who said in working with survivors, the account of Job can be a helpful story because so many survivors struggle with the why question. Why didn't God answer my prayer to stop the abuse? Well, Job struggled with that question, and God refused to answer and said, I'm God, you're not. My ways are not your ways. But we can talk about the how question. How do we get through it together? And I will walk the dark valley with you. When I teach faith leaders, I say, you got to understand ACE research. You got to understand polyvictimization research because somebody is struggling with alcohol or anger or promiscuity or whatever the conduct is, you tend to focus on what you call sins, and you're treating the fire and ignoring you're treating the smoke, ignoring the underlying fire. So you got to shift from asking what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And when you make that shift, you'll probably find a lot of things that you were not expecting. And then with your list of referrals, you can make good referrals to appropriate medical and mental health care, and then you can begin to provide spiritual care in concert with these other professionals. But stay within your lane. You are a spiritual care advisor, a pastoral care worker. You're not a psychologist. Refrain from platitudes. So many survivors have said, I hate it. I finally went to my pastor, and he or she gave me a prayer, a Bible verse, a platitude, and I'm supposed to be better when I get home. It just doesn't work for me. I need somebody who will walk the dark valley with me, and that may take months. It may take years. It may take until the end of my life. So many survivors have said, I talked to my pastor, particularly in the Christian community, and they focus on Jesus saying, you got to forgive, and if you can't forgive, God won't forgive you. And so they say you have to forgive. And when a pastor says that, they sound an awful lot like the perpetrator, because the perpetrator usually uses those Bible verses as well and says, Jesus says you have to forgive me. And if you can't forgive me, then there's something wrong with you spiritually. So don't ever go to the issue of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a gift of God. It'll come on its own if it comes at all. Instead, focus on justice and mercy and righteous indignation. Those are the stories a survivor needs to hear at the outset. There's a passage in Matthew 18 that says you got to talk to the person who hurt you and try to make some sort of reconciliation. So many survivors will say to their pastoral care worker, I want to meet with dad or mom or grandpa, whoever it is that has abused me. So we teach faith leaders that's really dangerous because the offender will still have cognitive distortions. They may admit the abuse, but they'll say to the victim, you never said no, or you had an orgasm, or I brought you out of your shell. I made you the person you are today. It was good for you. And they will then emotionally abuse the child all over again. So encourage the person to speak to their mental health provider if they want to have such a meeting to sort through pros and cons. If they're an adult and you can't stop them from having the meeting, figure out a game plan. Who's going to be with you? Your mental health provider, your pastor, somebody else, so that we can regulate the conversation, and most importantly, we can be there immediately in the aftermath to help you cope with such a conversation. Kelly Clark used to sue churches. He's now deceased, but he wrote this great law review article, and he said to faith leaders, actually, none of my clients wanted to sue you. Not a single one of them wanted to sue you. You just pissed them off. He said it in more legal terms there, but that's essentially what he said in the article. He said, here's all my clients wanted from you. They wanted an apology with no ands, ifs, or buts. If you would say something like, I'm sorry we didn't know. I'm sorry we didn't know then what we know now. They didn't like that. They just wanted to hear, I'm so sorry this happened to you. How can we help? That's all they wanted from you, but you couldn't give it to them. A lot of times they wanted symbolic gestures that would help them cope. Several survivors of a Baptist minister go to the church elders and they say, we want to come back to church, but we want a memorial rock garden for all the children who were abused here. That'll be soothing and comforting. And the elders said, we can't do that because then for the rest of history, people will know we used to have a child molester in our employment. And so they got ticked off, and they went to Kelly Clark, and Kelly said, you know, it doesn't sound like the old boys get it. I think $7.5 million would capture their attention. So he sued them and got a judgment for $7.5 million. The rock garden would have been cheaper. Many survivors, like the one I told you about before, they want to be part of the solution. They want to read your policies. They want to be engaged in training and reform. It can be empowering. They don't want you to rewrite the history. And a lot of times they just need practical things. Minister once called me and said, hey, we got this woman when she was a child, she was sexually abused at her church by a youth minister. No doubt it happened. He's in prison. And she gave us all these medical records, and apparently she can't control her sexual urges. She has sex with everybody, and there's some medication that would help her. And it seems legitimate, but the lawyer for our church says don't do it. It'd be like an admission of liability, and she's going to turn around and sue you. But you know what? We actually have a fund to help people who are struggling, and we kind of want to pay it, but our lawyer says not to do it. And I'm just wondering what you think, Victor. I said, what's the name of your church? And he said, First Christian something something. And I said, I guess I just focus on the word Christian, because what I'm hearing is your guy raped her, and she has a legitimate medical health need, and you could actually provide it. I think if you provide that medical service, she's not going to sue you. Stop listening to the lawyers. Stop listening to the insurance companies. Start listening to Jesus. That's what I told him. But anyway. He did. He did, and she didn't sue her. I have a beautiful story of a pastor who said to me he had this woman who was very faithful in attendance, and then she just stopped coming to church. So he tracked her down after a few weeks and said, hey, something wrong? You haven't seen you for a while. And she said, well, you played that hymn. And he said, well, tell me about that. Well, my dad, when I was a little girl, used to touch me sexually, but during the abuse, he would always hum a certain hymn. And I loved your church all these years because that song isn't in the hymnal. But then you put it up on the PowerPoint last week and said, we're going to play this special hymn because it really fits our Bible passage. And it was all I could do to avoid breaking down in church. But I got home and I cried for 3 days. I can't do it. I ain't going back to church because you might play that hymn again. What is good pastoral care? we're not going to play it anymore. I didn't know. I am so sorry. And that was all she needed to go back to church. So it's listening. We try to teach faith leaders to listen and think creatively of how you can reconnect the faith community. I worked with a survivor who was sexually abused on a church altar. And so she said to a pastor, I want to come back to church, but every church I look at in this community has an altar, and that triggers memories because my dad used to abuse me on the altar. And he said, hey, we can do a house church. The early church did that. We can think creatively to reconnect you to your faith traditions. When I went through seminary, the pastoral care course, by the way, I drove everybody nuts in seminary. I don't care what the topic was. To me, it all came back to child abuse. That's why they graduated me. I'm going to get him out of here. In any event, so in my pastoral care course, they didn't talk about ACEs. So I began to talk about ACEs, and then Professor Frombach said, could you give a lecture at the next class on ACEs? I said, sure, I could do that. In any event, one day he wrote this on the board. He said, sometimes as a pastor, you're going to have somebody who's faced something that is just overwhelming to you as you hear it, and you don't know what to say and you don't know what to do, and it can be helpful to say, I don't know what to say and I don't know what to do, but I'm going to stick with you until we figure it out together. And I thought that was good pastoral care. This study was published in 2017 by Tishelman and Fonte's Qualitative Interview. They spoke with forensic interviewers across the country who collectively had interviewed thousands of children and documented how many times these interviewers said, yeah, kids do raise spiritual, religious questions during the interview or the MDT investigation. And they found ad hoc, a lot of CACs are reaching out to faith leaders to help a child cope. And this article says that's a really good idea, but we need to be more proactive in educating our faith leaders to find those who are trauma-informed, who can work collaboratively with the CAC, and then we need to be providing them services as well. The NCA standards, for those of you who work in accredited CAC, speak of cultural competency and understanding the worldview of the children who come into your care, and that includes their religious heritage. So we designed a course we used to call Chaplains for Children. Now we call it Keeping Faith. And we bring faith leaders and child protection professionals, medical and mental health providers, and we get them in the same room. We go through this research, and then we give them actual case scenarios and put them in small groups and say, work out your solution for integrating medical, mental health, and spiritual care, and otherwise addressing the needs articulated by the child or the adult survivor. And then they do presentations, and our team of experts critiques them on whether they came up with some good ideas or not. And we're working with Cindy and Rob Miller-Perrin to research that program. I mentioned a chaplain in Greenville. Here she is on the screen, Carrie Nettles. She used to be a pediatric chaplain, so she was used to working with kids who faced trauma. And then she came through our Chaplains for Children program, and she took me aside and said, I want to be the first chaplain inside a children's advocacy center. And do you know anybody in South Carolina? And I connected her to Shauna Galloway-Williams, who's the CAC director up here. Shauna, by her own admission, is the least religious person in the world, really does not like faith traditions. But she also heard me speak, and then she was frustrated because she didn't want to do it. And then she read the research for herself and said, darn it. Actually, she used stronger words than that, but Victor's right. The research actually says that. And then all of a sudden, here's Carrie Nettles saying, I want to be this chaplain. And she goes and gets a crime victims grant and hires a CAC chaplain. So how does it work? Well, families who come through, just as you would when you go through a hospital, say among the services we offer is chaplaincy services, and you can take it or leave it, right? That's one part of her job. If somebody asks for the care, she will meet with them, and then she'll provide follow-up spiritual care. So she gets involved in the whole faith community and identifies those who are truly trauma-informed or provides that education so she can make the right referral to the right priest, the right rabbi, the right pastor for follow-up care. She also takes the lead in teaching the area faith community about all of these issues and more. And we're working on research to see, is it as effective as anecdotal evidence suggests? And as I mentioned, she takes the lead in prevention planning in the faith community. When she and others work in the faith community at our direction, we start with the CDC standards, but then we say theologically, that's pretty small, right? Because if you're only going to protect kids from being sexually abused within the faith community, then you're ignoring most abused children. Because most kids are abused in the home. 60% of sexually abused kids are abused in the home. 90% plus of kids are physically abused, emotionally abused, neglected, and are witnessing violence. It's in the home. So a true faith tradition who really takes God seriously, we argue, would go well beyond these secular standards. Shira Berkovitz is a PhD psychologist and lawyer who got a grant to develop policies in synagogues across the country. She worked with us, and she developed this extraordinary document that goes well beyond the CDC standards. She worked with Bazio Chavidjian. The version of the book for the Christian community was published last year. The synagogue version will be published this year. Well, would it make a difference if you challenged a faith community theologically and say you need to go well beyond what secular communities are recommending? Would it make a difference? Well, here's anecdotal evidence that's just 14 days old. The Southern Baptist Convention hired this commission to assess sexual abuse within that church body. And when they got to the policy section, they actually quoted a theological paper I wrote saying a true Christian witness would shatter the CD standards and go well beyond that. And they say in their paper, we need to shatter those standards and go well beyond that. And we're in essence recommending things that we originally did in that synagogue guide. We in the CAC world can be working with churches who have a sex offender. They don't know how to manage this population. We can give them good advice. We can connect them to people like Dr. Anna Salter and carve out a good plan for managing sex offenders. And we can be proactive in having healthy collaborations. I love the Halos project that began in South Carolina. Synagogues, churches, they engage in child abuse prevention initiatives, and they have a program called Adopt a Social Worker. And they say, if you got a child in foster care as a need the government can't provide, you let us know, and that's our job. So there's a child in foster care who gets asked out to prom. Well, she doesn't have money for a prom dress. She explains the situation to her foster parents, who explain the situation to the social worker, who explains the situation to Halos. Halos sends out an email blast, we got a child who needs a prom dress. And somebody responds and says, well, I own a shop here, a dress shop. It's on the house. She can come by. We'll get her the best prom house. And somebody says, I can do better than that. I'm the manager of the best restaurant here in Charleston. Dinner for two, her and her date on the house. Oh, yeah? Well, I run the best limousine company in Charleston, and her date, they can have a limo the entire evening on the house, well beyond what the child was asking. That is a promising practice, according to the Office of Victims of Crime. And in my home state of Minnesota, 7 counties have a Halos project. Faith Trust Institute's been around for 40 years, training faith leaders on child abuse, domestic violence, elder abuse. I mentioned Sacred Spaces is doing extraordinary things and has won a number of national awards for what they're doing in the Jewish community. I'm proud to be on their board of directors, and through them I've taught rabbis around the world. I'm on the board of directors of Grace that's done amazing things in the Christian community. I really did go to seminary. That's proof right there. You don't have to write on your evaluation. I know my hat is crooked. That's not the point. The point is the diploma is signed from an accredited seminary. So I've been using it to do what I can, and so I helped the ABA develop this new publication for working with conservative Protestants, many of whom sincerely believe that God requires them to hit their children with a stick. You can move them past that dime if you're culturally sensitive, so we developed guidelines, and the APSAC advisor, the most recent issue that's open access, plus I gave it as a handout, I walked through how doctors and others can work with that dynamic. We have a running a collaboration with this very prestigious seminary journal, and we did an entire issue on coordinating medical, mental health, and spiritual care, a whole host of articles, some of which I gave you as handouts. It's all open access. You can access all of them, and we're going to continue to publish through that journal to help the faith world get engaged with the child protection world. This was my seminary thesis, which was published as a book where I really challenged Christians to take Jesus seriously, and if you took Jesus seriously, things would change pretty dramatically overnight. And I was moved to tears when the Southern Baptist Convention report said, well, Victor challenged us to take Jesus seriously and we should do it. And that was a big moment in my life, and I hope they follow up with their recommendations. And I think you can do this in any faith tradition. I'm working through this book by Dr. Bunge. She took the 6 largest religions in the world, and it's just a book with all their sacred texts pertaining to children. And so I'm about halfway through the book. So I think if you're working in the Muslim community, the Buddhist community, whatever it is, you can find sacred writings pertaining to children and child abuse and use that to engage somebody theologically to do amazing things in child protection. And early research suggests engaging folks theologically in a culturally sensitive way does make a difference. I know we're 2 minutes over time. Can I go 1 minute over time? And I'll leave you with, I think, a hopeful story. This is one of my heroes, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. was a Lutheran minister executed by the Nazis because of his opposition to the government. For some time, he was housed at Tegel prison in Berlin. Nighttime at the prison was known as the terrible time. It was at nighttime that Allied bombs would land on the city, accidentally strike the prison, injure, even kill the men warehoused there. It was at nighttime that Nazi guards would take men from their cells, beat, torture, even execute them. So every night when the sun set at Tegel, the men would go to the edges of their cells, they would grasp the bars, and from man to man, cell to cell, they would repeat the refrain, "Till the night be past, pray for me. Till the night be past, pray for me." Tonight here in Salt Lake and all over this country, for many children, nighttime is the terrible time. It's at nighttime that many children are beaten or shaken to death. It's at nighttime that many children are violated sexually. It's at nighttime that many children go to bed hungry. They cry themselves to sleep. They live, they move, but they have no being. These are the shadow children of our country, boys and girls, young and younger, who from the corners of the room ask us simply, is it safe to come out now? All of you have dedicated your lives to the proposition we should answer this question, yes. Yes, it is safe to come out now. For who you are, for what you do, for what you are about to do, I am forever in awe. Thank you for sharing the morning with me.